His face is on the cover of the record. His hips are on the television screen. His voice is on the radio. But was his name in a secret file, listed not as a celebrity but as an asset? Elvis Presley was the king of rock and roll. He was a global icon. He was also a man of contradictions. He was a symbol of rebellion who craved acceptance from the establishment. He was a millionaire who collected police badges like a kid collects baseball cards. This fascination with law and order led him down a path that crossed directly with the most powerful and secretive man in America, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Years after Elvis's death, the Freedom of Information Act opened up a window into their strange relationship. The FBI released hundreds of pages of documents related to Elvis. They were filled with death threats, extortion plots, and fan mail. But they also revealed Elvis's own attempts to connect with the Bureau. He wanted to help. He wanted to be one of them. He offered his services, his fame, his influence to fight what he saw as a rising tide of anti-Americanism. The official story is that the FBI politely declined. They saw him as a well-meaning, but ultimately unserious celebrity. The files seem to support this. But what if the files don't tell the whole story? What if the official story is a cover? The unverified claims suggest a deeper, stranger reality. They paint a picture of Elvis not as a singer who liked cops, but as a secret operative, a man living a double life, using his fame as the ultimate disguise. We think we know Elvis. But do we really? Or number 15 was his famous meeting with Nixon, an FBI audition. The photograph is one of the most requested in the history of the National Archives. Elvis Presley in a purple velvet suit with a giant gold belt buckle and a Colt 45 pistol in a display case, shaking hands with President Richard Nixon in the Oval Office. It happened on December 21st, 1970. The story of how it came to be is almost as strange as the picture itself. Elvis, upset with the direction the country was heading, decided he needed to do something. He spontaneously flew to Washington, D.C. On the plane, he scribbled a 6-page letter to President Nixon. He wrote about his love for his country and his concern over the drug culture and the hippie elements. He said he wanted to help. Specifically, he wanted a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs Indeed, the forerunner to the DEA. He believed this badge would give him the authority to go undercover and fight the good fight. He hand-delivered the letter to a guard at the White House gate. In a remarkable turn of events, the letter made its way to Nixon's aide, Egil Bud Krogh. Krogh, seeing a huge public relations opportunity to connect the president with a young audience, arranged the meeting for that very day. The claim that this meeting was an FBI audition stems from this context. Proponents of this theory believe Elvis wasn't just on a whim. They argue he was making a formal play to become a federal agent at large, and the meeting with Nixon was his way of going over J. Edgar Hoover's head. He was presenting his credentials directly to the commander-in-chief. He told Nixon he had done an in-depth study of drug abuse and communist brainwashing techniques. He offered himself as a unique asset, someone who could connect with the youth of America in a way no government agent ever could. He wasn't just asking for a souvenir, he was applying for a job. The evidence for this claim is circumstantial, built on Elvis's own words and actions. In his letter, he name-dropped Vice President Spiro Agnew and said he could go right to the top. He wasn't acting like a fan asking for an autograph, he was acting like a patriot offering his services for a covert role. He even brought Nixon a gift, the commemorative pistol, a gesture more fitting for a diplomat or an operative than a pop star. The whole event was shrouded in a kind of surreal secrecy. It wasn't a public press event. It was a private meeting arranged in hours between the most powerful man in the world and the world's biggest entertainer. Those who believe the audition theory say that the B&D badge was just the first step. It was the entry point. Once he had federal credentials, he could then be quietly activated by the FBI or other agencies. However, the verifiable facts paint a much simpler, if still bizarre, picture. The meeting was entirely the work of Bud Krogh and the White House staff, not the FBI. The FBI files from this period show no involvement in setting it up. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover was famously wary of celebrities and likely would have blocked such a meeting if he could have. The badge Elvis received was purely honorary. It carried no actual law enforcement authority. It was a symbolic gesture, a thank you gift from a president who was happy to get a photo op with a superstar. The BNDD itself confirmed this later. They issued thousands of these honorary badges to civilians. As for Elvis's in-depth study, there is no evidence he had any formal knowledge of counterintelligence or drug enforcement tactics. His understanding was based on his own observations and perhaps a few books on the occult and communism he was known to read. His friend Jerry Schilling, who was with him that day, has always maintained that Elvis's primary motivation was to get the badge. He was an obsessive collector, and a federal narcotics badge was the ultimate prize. The idea of him going undercover was more of a personal fantasy than a concrete plan. The Nixon meeting wasn't an audition for the FBI. It was the ultimate lobbying effort for a piece of memorabilia. But some questions linger. If it was just about a badge, why did Elvis feel the need to write a 6-page manifesto about his patriotism and his fears for America? Why did he offer to use his status as a king to influence young people? And what was really said in the Oval Office that day beyond the official memos? Was there a quiet understanding, a nod and a wink from the president, that this honorary badge was just the beginning of a new secret chapter in Elvis's life? Number 14, did J. Edgar Hoover personally recruit Elvis? The idea of a secret partnership between Elvis Presley and the FBI almost always leads back to one man, J. Edgar Hoover. For 48 years, Hoover was the FBI. He built it from the ground up and wielded its power with an iron fist. He was a master of secrets, collecting files on presidents, movie stars, and activists. If Elvis was truly a secret agent for the Bureau, the theory goes, the order must have come from the top. The claim is that Hoover, seeing both the threat and the opportunity that Elvis represented, personally recruited him. In this version of the story, Hoover recognized that Elvis was more than just a singer. He was a cultural force who had the ear of America's youth. In the tense atmosphere of the Cold War and the social upheaval of the 1960s, an asset like Elvis would be invaluable. The proponents of this theory imagine a secret meeting, perhaps at a hotel or a private residence, where the aging director laid out his vision for the young king. Hoover, the ultimate patriot, would have seen a kindred spirit in Elvis, who openly expressed his love for his country and his distrust of counterculture movements. Elvis, with his access to Hollywood, Las Vegas, and the music industry, could be Hoover's eyes and ears. He could report on drug use, communist sympathizers, and the decadent lifestyles of other celebrities. The recruitment would have been off the books, a gentleman's agreement between two American icons. Elvis wouldn't be a numbered agent. He would be a special source, his identity protected by the director himself. The lack of any official record of this meeting is, for believers, proof that it happened. It was too secret to ever be written down. The evidence is based on inference and a romanticized view of both men. We know Elvis desperately wanted to be associated with the FBI. He wrote letters directly to Hoover offering his help. On January 4th, 1971, shortly after his meeting with Nixon, Elvis visited the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and asked for a tour and a meeting with the director. He was given a special tour, a sign of his celebrity status. This visit is often cited as the moment the recruitment could have taken place. He was inside the lion's den. Who's to say a private conversation didn't happen? Furthermore, Elvis's known conservative political views and his anti-drug stance align perfectly with Hoover's public persona. It seems like a natural fit. But the actual FBI files released under the Freedom of Information Act tell a completely different story. They show that Hoover and the FBI brass viewed Elvis with a mixture of suspicion and condescension. Far from recruiting him, Hoover seemed to want nothing to do with him. In a memo dated from Elvis's visit to FBI headquarters, Hoover himself wrote a note in the margin. Regarding Elvis's offer to help, Hoover scrawled, "His motives are good, but I think he is an entertainer and should stick to that." Another internal memo from a top FBI official, T.E. Bishop, was even more dismissive. He wrote that Elvis's past history and general appearance were not in keeping with the image of FBI agents. He specifically mentioned Elvis's hippie type, hair, and clothing. The memos make it clear that while they gave him a polite tour, they considered his offer of help to be a joke. There is not a single piece of paper in the hundreds of pages of his FBI file that suggests a personal relationship, let alone a recruitment, by Hoover. The director was notoriously puritanical and image-conscious. The idea that he would secretly align himself with a rock and roll singer known for his gyrating hips and decadent lifestyle is contrary to everything we know about him. The files show the FBI's interest in Elvis was primarily reactive. They investigated death threats against him, extortion attempts, and complaints from the public about his performances. They saw him as a public figure to be managed, not an asset to be cultivated. The story of a personal recruitment by Hoover appears to be pure fantasy, a myth born from the desire to connect two larger-than-life American figures. Yet, the questions remain. Could the official memos be a deliberate misdirection, a paper trail created to provide plausible deniability? Was Hoover's handwritten dismissal of Elvis a double bluff, meant to be seen by lower-level agents while the real relationship remained hidden? And if Elvis wasn't recruited by Hoover, why did he continue to believe he had a special connection to the Bureau for the rest of his life? Number 13, did the FBI help Elvis fake his death? Of all the unverified claims surrounding Elvis, this is the most enduring. The theory that Elvis did not die on August 16, 1977, has been a cottage industry for decades. There have been alleged sightings, books, and documentaries dedicated to the idea that the king is still alive. A key component of this sprawling conspiracy theory is that he could not have pulled it off alone. He would have needed help from a powerful organization, one with the resources and expertise to create a new identity, erase his past, and protect him from being discovered. The organization most often credited with this incredible feat is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The claim is that the FBI, in exchange for his years of Secret Service, helped Elvis fake his death and enter a form of witness protection. According to this theory, Elvis's life as a superstar had become a prison. He was hounded by fans, betrayed by friends, and trapped by his own fame. More importantly, he was in danger. Some versions of the theory suggest he had gathered dangerous information on the mafia or a powerful drug cartel during his time as an undercover informant. His life was at risk, and the only way out was to disappear completely. The FBI, obligated to protect their valuable asset, orchestrated the entire event. They found a body double or used a specially made wax dummy for the casket. They falsified the death certificate and the autopsy report. They paid off medical personnel and funeral home employees. Then, they whisked the real Elvis away on a secret flight to a new quiet life somewhere else. The proof offered for this claim is a collection of anomalies and supposed clues. Believers point to the misspelling of his middle name, Aaron instead of Aaron, on his tombstone as a deliberate sign that the man buried there is not him. They cite the strange, waxy appearance of the body in the casket, as described by some who attended the viewing. They mention the fact that his life insurance policy was never cashed, and of course there are the countless sightings of an older Elvis in places like Kalamazoo, Michigan, or a supermarket in a small town. Gail Brewer Giorgio's 1988 book, Is Elvis Alive?, was a key text in popularizing these ideas. It even included a supposed audio recording of Elvis talking about his life after 1097. The role of the FBI in this narrative is crucial. They are the puppet masters. The declassified FBI files on Elvis are scoured for evidence. While the files primarily contain records of threats made against Elvis, believers see this as proof that he was in danger. They argue that the sheer volume of threats, some from organized crime, gave the FBI the perfect justification to stage his death. The fact that the government has never officially debunked the Elvis is alive theory is also seen as a tacit admission that they have something to hide. Why not just come out and put the rumors to rest? However, the verifiable evidence that Elvis Presley died in 1977 is overwhelming. His death was confirmed by his family, his friends, the medical examiner, and the hospital staff. The Shelby County medical examiner, Dr. Jerry Francisco, performed an autopsy and signed the death certificate listing the cause of death as cardiac arrest. While the details of his health problems and prescription drug use were controversial, the fact of his death was not. The anomalies cited by conspiracy theorists have all been explained. The tombstone misspelling was a family preference at the time and has since been corrected. The waxy appearance of the body is common with mortuary cosmetics. The life insurance policy may have been structured in a way that didn't require a public claim. The sightings have all been of impersonators or men who simply resemble an older Elvis. There is absolutely nothing in the FBI files to suggest they were involved in faking his death. The files end around the time of his death. There are no memos planning an extraction, no budget requests for a new identity, no correspondence about a witness protection arrangement. The idea of the FBI dedicating such massive resources to help a celebrity disappear, especially one they internally regarded with some disdain, strains credulity. It's a compelling story of fantasy, of escape and second chances, but it appears to have no basis in reality. Still, the what-ifs are tantalizing. What if there is a deeper, more classified set of files on Elvis that has never been released? If the FBI did help him disappear, would there be any paper trail left for the public to find? And is it possible that the greatest act of the world's greatest showman was convincing everyone he had left the stage for good? Or number 12, was he a secret informant on John Lennon? This claim connects two of the biggest musical icons of the 20th century in a secret conflict. On one side, Elvis Presley, the patriotic, establishment-friendly king of rock and roll. On the other, John Lennon, the anti-war activist and counterculture hero. The theory is that Elvis, in his capacity as a friend of the FBI, acted as an informant against Lennon. He saw Lennon's political activism and anti-Vietnam War stance as a threat to America, and used his influence to bring him to the attention of federal authorities. The foundation for this claim is very real. It lies in Elvis's 1970 meeting with President Nixon. In his letter to the president, Elvis specifically mentioned his concerns about the influence of certain musicians on the youth. While he didn't name names in the letter, White House aide Gil Bud Krogh, who sat in on the meeting, later wrote in his book The Day Elvis Met Nixon that Elvis was very specific in person. Krogh recalled Elvis saying, "The Beatles, I think, are kind of anti-American. They came over here, made a lot of money, and then went back to England and said some un-American stuff." He believed their drug use and anti-establishment message were poisoning the minds of young people. This conversation happened at the highest level of government. Elvis was, in effect, reporting a fellow musician to the President of the United States. The theory extends beyond this single meeting. Proponents suggest this was not a one-off complaint, but part of an ongoing effort. Elvis, they claim, provided information to the FBI about Lennon's activities, his associates, and his political leanings. This would have been happening during the early 1970s, a time when the Nixon administration was actively trying to deport Lennon, seeing him as a major disruptive force who could influence the 1972 presidential election. The FBI did indeed have a thick file on John Lennon, compiled as part of their surveillance of anti-war and New Left figures. The claim is that some of the information in that file came from a source code named Mr. Presley or something similar. The idea is compelling because it fits a known narrative. We know the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover and as part of its COINTELPRO program, used informants to spy on activists. We know Nixon's administration was paranoid about Lennon, and we know Elvis held political views that were diametrically opposed to Lennon's. It seems plausible that Elvis, in his desire to be a secret agent, would have seen Lennon as a perfect target. John Wiener, a historian who fought a long legal battle to get Lennon's FBI files declassified, documented the government's intense surveillance campaign in his book, Gimme Some Truth. The John Lennon FBI files. While the files are heavily redacted, they show a clear pattern of harassment and monitoring. However, there is no direct evidence in either Elvis's or Lennon's FBI files to support the claim that Elvis was a formal informant. While Elvis certainly made his feelings known to Nixon, that is different from being an active reporting source for the Bureau. Elvis's FBI file contains no reports filed by him about Lennon or anyone else. Lennon's file, extensive as it is, does not name Elvis as a source. The FBI's interest in Lennon was self-generated, fueled by his high-profile anti-war activities, like his plans for a concert tour that would coincide with the '72 election campaign. They didn't need Elvis to tell him John Lennon was a political activist. Most historians conclude that Elvis's comments to Nixon were just that, comments. He was voicing his personal conservative opinions to a sympathetic ear. He was grandstanding, trying to show the president how patriotic he was. He was not acting as a trained informant delivering intelligence. His knowledge of Lennon's activities was likely no more than what he read in the newspapers. The story of Elvis the Snitch is likely an exaggeration of this one documented event blown up into a full-blown espionage drama. But the questions persist. Could Elvis's informant reports be located in a different, more secret file, perhaps one related to national security or COINTELPRO, that has not been released? Was his identity as a source protected by a codename that we simply haven't deciphered from the redacted files? And did Elvis's verbal complaint to the President of the United States set in motion a chain of events that intensify the government's campaign against John Lennon, making him an indirect, if not a direct, informant? Number 11. Was he secretly investigating the mafia? Elvis Presley's life was deeply intertwined with Las Vegas. From his triumphant return to live performing in 1969 until his death, he was the city's biggest star. And in those days, Las Vegas was synonymous with the mafia. The casinos he performed in, like the International Hotel, later the Las Vegas Hilton, were often linked to organized crime figures. This proximity has led to the claim that Elvis was more than just a performer in Vegas. He was secretly investigating the mob for the FBI. He was using his unprecedented access as the ultimate insider to gather intelligence on the shadowy figures who ran the city. The theory suggests that Elvis, with his law enforcement obsession and his patriotic fervor, saw the mafia as another anti-American force that needed to be stopped. His role as the city's top entertainer gave him the perfect cover. He could move freely in the casinos, backstage, and in the high roller suites where mobsters made their deals. He could overhear conversations, observe transactions, and build relationships with key people, all under the guise of being the friendly, apolitical superstar. He would then feed this information back to his handlers at the FBI. His friendship with people like Tom Jones, who also performed in Vegas, could have been part of this intelligence gathering network. Some of the evidence for this claim comes from anecdotes and the context of the time. The FBI was heavily invested in fighting organized crime in the 1960s and 70s under the direction of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and later through the RICO Act. They needed inside sources. Who better than Elvis? Stories from members of his entourage, the Memphis Mafia, sometimes mention Elvis's awareness of the less savory characters around him. He was not naive about who owned the hotels. The claim is that his fascination with collecting police badges and guns was not just a hobby, but part of his preparation for this dangerous undercover role. He saw himself as a real-life crime fighter. Furthermore, Elvis's own FBI file contains information about the Mafia, but with a crucial twist. The file shows that the FBI was investigating threats made by the Mafia against Elvis. In 1970, the FBI's Los Angeles office opened a file after receiving a threat that Elvis would be kidnapped and held for ransom. Another report detailed an extortion attempt. The FBI took these threats seriously, providing security and surveillance. Believers in the informant theory argue this is a classic misdirection. The files were created to make Elvis look like a potential victim, thereby protecting his true identity as an operative. The best way to hide an informant is to make it look like he is the target of the very people he is investigating. However, a straightforward reading of the FBI files and biographies of Elvis leads to a much different conclusion. There is no evidence whatsoever that Elvis was providing intelligence to the FBI. The files show a one-way street. The FBI collected information about threats to Elvis to protect him, not the other way around. He was a protectee, not an asset. Members of his inner circle, like his friend Jerry Schilling and his wife Priscilla Presley, have never mentioned any such undercover activity. They portray Elvis as being consumed by his career, his health problems, and his personal life, not by a secret war against the mob. His relationships in Vegas seem to have been purely professional. He was the star, and the hotel management, regardless of their connections, treated him like gold because he brought in millions of dollars. He was insulated from the grittier side of the business by his own fame and his large entourage. While he was certainly aware of the presence of organized crime, the idea that he was actively engaged in a dangerous espionage campaign against them seems to be a fantasy, projecting his love for law enforcement onto his real-life situation. The real story in the FBI files is that Elvis, as a wealthy celebrity, was a target for criminals, not an agent hunting them. But could the files be incomplete? If Elvis was a high-level source in a major organized crime investigation, would his reports be kept in his general celebrity file, or in a separate, highly classified case file that remains sealed? Was the FBI's official protection of Elvis actually a cover for his real mission, allowing agents to be near him without arousing suspicion? And did Elvis Presley, the boy from Tupelo, secretly see himself as the one man who could clean up Sin City? Number 10, was he an operative for COINTELPRO? COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was a series of covert and often illegal projects conducted by the FBI between 1956 and 1971. Its goal was to surveil, infiltrate, discredit, and disrupt domestic political organizations that the Bureau deemed subversive. The targets included the Communist Party USA, civil rights groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference SLC and the Black Panther Party, anti-Vietnam War organizers, and figures of the New Left. The tactics were ruthless, including psychological warfare, planting false media stories, harassment, and inciting violence. The claim is that Elvis Presley, with his conservative views and desire to help the government, was a willing participant in this program. This theory places Elvis at the dark heart of the FBI's domestic spying operations. It suggests that his role went beyond being a passive patriot. He was an active operative, using his unique position as a touring musician to gather information on COINTELPRO targets. When he played a concert in a city, he could report on the political climate, identify local activists, or gauge the mood of the youth. His celebrity gave him access to people and places that would be off limits to a typical FBI agent. He could attend parties, meet other musicians, and interact with student groups, all while secretly taking notes for his FBI handlers. The evidence for this claim is highly speculative and based on connecting several dots. First, Elvis's known political leanings. He was a vocal supporter of law and order and expressed deep concern about what he saw as the un-American activities of protesters and hippies. This aligns perfectly with the ideology behind COINTELPRO. Second, his direct offers to help the FBI and President Nixon. His 1970 letter to Nixon is a key document where he states his desire to fight the drug culture, the hippie elements, the SDS, Black Panthers, etc. These were the exact groups targeted by COINTELPRO. He was, in effect, volunteering for the program. Third, the timing fits. The peak of COINTELPRO's activities in the late 1960s coincided with Elvis's comeback and his renewed expressions of patriotism. Historians like Ward Churchill and Jim Vander Wall, in their book The COINTELPRO Papers, documented the extensive reach and shocking tactics of the program. They showed how the FBI used informants from all walks of life. The theory posits why not the most famous person in the world. And Elvis's concerts could have been used as data gathering opportunities. The FBI could have asked him to report on the security situation, the presence of radical groups, or even the backstage behavior of other performers who might be sympathetic to anti-war causes. However, there is a complete lack of any documentary evidence to support this explosive claim. The massive trove of COINTELPRO documents that have been declassified through lawsuits and FOIA requests have revealed the names of many informants and the details of many operations. Elvis Presley's name has never appeared in any of them as a source or operative. His own FBI file, while showing his desire to help, does not contain any reports or memoranda that would link him to any specific counterintelligence operation. The official FBI response, as seen in their internal memos, was to keep him at arm's length. They saw him as an unreliable celebrity, not a disciplined operative suitable for sensitive undercover work. Furthermore, Elvis's lifestyle was the antithesis of a covert agent. He was surrounded at all times by a large, talkative entourage. His life was an open book, filled with impulsive behavior and a deepening dependence on prescription drugs. This is not the profile of a man entrusted with the secrets of the FBI's most controversial domestic spying program. It is far more likely that Elvis's anti-communist, anti-protester rhetoric was his own, a reflection of his conservative Southern upbringing, rather than a script given to him by the FBI. He was a concerned citizen, albeit a very famous one, not a government spy. But the silence in the files is what fuels the theory. If Elvis was one of COINTELPRO's most high-profile assets, wouldn't his involvement be one of the government's most closely guarded secrets, perhaps still classified today? Could his offers to fight the Black Panthers and SDS have been quietly accepted, with his role kept entirely off the books? And is it possible that when Elvis sang In the Ghetto, he was doing more than just performing a song, but was also observing a community for his powerful friends in Washington? Number 9. Did the FBI deliberately ignore his drug use? Elvis Presley's battle with prescription drug abuse is a tragic and well-documented part of his life story. By the mid-1970s, he was heavily dependent on a cocktail of powerful sedatives, amphetamines, and painkillers, all supplied by his personal physician, Dr. George Nichopoulos, often known as Dr. Nick. This drug use contributed to his declining health and his premature death. The claim in this context is that the federal government, particularly the FBI and the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs Indeed, knew about the extent of his addiction, but deliberately looked the other way. They did this, the theory goes, because Elvis was too valuable an asset to lose. His secret work for the government granted him a form of immunity. According to this theory, Elvis's status as a secret informant or a cultural ally of the Nixon administration put him above the law. The B&D, which was aggressively pursuing doctors and celebrities involved in illegal prescription schemes, would have had Elvis and Dr. Nick on their radar. The sheer volume of drugs being prescribed was astronomical. In the last year of Elvis's life alone, Dr. Nick prescribed him thousands of doses of various controlled substances. An investigation would have been inevitable for any ordinary citizen. The fact that Elvis was never investigated or charged is seen by believers as proof of a high-level cover-up. The government was protecting its man. The evidence for this claim is the apparent lack of action from federal authorities despite overwhelming and public evidence of Elvis's decline. His erratic on-stage behavior, his slurred speech, and his dramatic weight gain were obvious to millions. The 1977 book, Elvis, What Happened, written by 3 of his former bodyguards, detailed his drug use in shocking detail. If the public knew, surely the FBI and the B&D knew. The theory suggests a quid pro quo. Elvis provides information or acts as a patriotic symbol, and in return, the government ensures his supply of drugs is not interrupted and his doctor is not prosecuted. His famous meeting with Nixon, where he offered to help fight the war on drugs, is seen as the height of irony, a clever move to position himself as an ally of the very people who should have been investigating him. However, the reality of the situation is more complex and less conspiratorial. While the FBI may have been aware of rumors about Elvis's lifestyle, their jurisdiction was limited. Prescription drug abuse fell primarily under the purview of the BNDD, later the DEA and state medical boards. The FBI's file on Elvis shows their focus was on extortion and death threats, not his personal health. But furthermore, in the 1970s, the laws and attitudes around prescription drug abuse by celebrities were different. It was often treated as a private medical issue, especially when the drugs were being supplied by a licensed physician. The key figure, Dr. Nicopolis, was eventually investigated. After Elvis's death, the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners charged him with gross malpractice and indiscriminately prescribing drugs. His medical license was suspended and eventually revoked. He was also indicted on criminal charges for overprescribing to Elvis and other patients, though he was acquitted. This shows that the system did eventually act. The action was taken at the state level, which was the proper jurisdiction, not the federal level. The idea that the FBI would intervene to stop a state medical board investigation is highly unlikely, and there is no evidence to support it. Elvis was protected not by a government conspiracy, but by his own fame, his wealth, and a doctor who was willing to supply his needs. He was insulated by a circle of enablers, not by a secret badge. Still, one has to wonder. Did federal narcotics agents ever open a preliminary file on Dr. Nicopolis and his most famous patient, only to have it quietly closed by a command from Washington? Given Elvis's direct offer to President Nixon to become a federal agent at large for the BND, was there an unofficial policy within the agency to leave him alone? And how deep did the hypocrisy run, with the government using a man as a symbol in the war on drugs, while he was privately one of its most high-profile casualties? Number 8 is his real FBI file, still a secret. When the FBI first released files on Elvis Presley under the Freedom of Information Act FOIA, it was a major event for researchers and fans. But the documents that were released raised as many questions as they answered. The file was hundreds of pages long, but many of those pages were covered in thick black lines. Entire paragraphs' names, and sometimes whole pages were redacted. This has led to one of the most fundamental claims about Elvis and the FBI. The file we can see is not the real file. The truly important information operates about his work as an informant, his secret missions. His fake death is hidden in those blacked out sections, or in a second, top secret file that has never been released. The theory is that the publicly available file is a smokescreen file. It was created to satisfy FOIA requests and give the appearance of transparency. It contains mundane information letters from the public, records of minor extortion attempts, and memos about his visit to FBI headquarters. This file makes Elvis look like a slightly eccentric celebrity who was a nuisance to the Bureau. This, believers say, is exactly the impression the FBI would want to create if they were trying to hide the fact that he was one of their most important assets. The real file, the operational file, would be classified under national security statutes and would never see the light of day. The evidence for this claim is the file itself. Why so many redactions if the content is harmless? Conspiracy theorists argue the blacked out sections hide the names of Elvis's FBI handlers, the code names for his operations, and the intelligence reports he submitted. They point to specific documents that are tantalizingly incomplete. For example, a memo might discuss a confidential source, and the rest of the paragraph is redacted. Believers immediately assume that source is Elvis. The sheer volume of the file, over 700 pages, is also seen as suspicious. Why would the FBI keep such a thick file on a mere entertainer unless there was more to the story? The nature of government secrecy feeds this theory. We know from declassified projects like COINTELPRO and MKUltra that the government is capable of keeping explosive secrets for decades. It is not a huge leap of faith to believe they could be doing the same with an Elvis file. The author of the book Elvis the FBI Files, Bill Adler, noted the strange and sometimes contradictory nature of the documents, leaving the door open to interpretation that something was being hidden. However, the practices of the FBI and the rules of the Freedom of Information Act offer a much more mundane explanation for the state of the file. Redactions are a standard and legally required part of any FOIA release, The law exempts certain types of information from disclosure. This includes information that could compromise national security, reveal law enforcement techniques, or, most commonly, violate the personal privacy of third parties. The names of FBI agents other than high-ranking officials, support staff, and private citizens who wrote to the FBI about Elvis are all routinely redacted to protect their privacy. This accounts for the vast majority of the blacked-out sections in Elvis's file. The file is large not because he was an agent, but because he was one of the most famous people in the world. For over 20 years, the FBI received a constant stream of mail about him. People wrote in to praise him, to condemn him as a menace to society, or to report supposed threats against him. The FBI, being a bureaucracy, kept a record of everything. The file is thick with crank letters and news clippings. The content, when read in its entirety, is overwhelmingly bureaucratic and unexciting. It documents the FBI's attempts to deal with the public phenomenon of Elvis Presley, not a secret partnership with him. There is no evidence a second, more secret file exists. But what if the privacy redactions are just a convenient excuse? Is it possible that under the black ink hiding the name of a private citizen is a report from Elvis about a fellow celebrity? Could the FBI be using standard procedure to hide an extraordinary secret in plain sight? And if there is no second file, why does the one we have feel so incomplete, like a puzzle with the most important pieces missing? Number 7. Was he using his entourage as an intelligence network? Elvis was never alone. He was constantly surrounded by a group of friends, employees, and hangers-on, known as the Memphis Mafia. This inner circle served as his bodyguards, his assistants, his companions, and his buffer against the outside world. The unverified claim here is that the Memphis Mafia was more than just an entourage. It was a carefully managed intelligence gathering network, with Elvis as its spymaster and the FBI as its ultimate client. According to this theory, Elvis structured his entourage to function as a team of operatives. Each member had a role. Some were responsible for security, others for logistics, and others for networking. As they traveled the country on tour, they were Elvis's eyes and ears. They could blend into crowds, talk to local law enforcement, and gather information in bars and hotels in a way Elvis himself could not. They could report on drug dealing in the music scene, the activities of political radicals who might show up at concerts, or any potential threats to public order. Elvis would then compile this information and pass it along to his contacts in the Bureau. The evidence for this claim is rooted in the military-style organization of the Memphis Mafia. Elvis was the undisputed captain. He gave them nicknames, bought them matching jewelry, and demanded absolute loyalty. This structure, proponents argue, is similar to how an intelligence agency might run a team of field agents. The constant presence of the group also provided a perfect cover. No one would suspect that these good old boy companions were actually engaged in surveillance. Their access was unparalleled. They were backstage at every show, at every party, in every city. Stories abound about the Memphis Mafia's activities. They were known to carry guns and were often mistaken for federal agents themselves. Elvis encouraged this persona, buying them police-style equipment and badges. This fascination with law enforcement was not just Elvis's hobby. The theory goes it was part of their cover story. He was training them. The book Elvis, What Happened, written by disgruntled former members Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, detailed the group's often violent and paranoid world. While the book was intended to be an expose of Elvis's drug use, some have interpreted the stories of security operations and obsessive monitoring of their surroundings as evidence of a more formal intelligence mission. However, a more realistic assessment suggests that the Memphis Mafia was exactly what it appeared to be: a group of young men from Elvis's hometown who were swept up in his incredible fame. Their primary job was to protect Elvis, cater to his every whim, and keep him company. The military structure was more about Elvis's personality, his need for control, and loyalty than any connection to the FBI. He had been in the army, and he liked that kind of camaraderie and hierarchy. Their obsession with security was a natural response to the very real threats and the intense fan pressure that surrounded a star of his magnitude. The FBI file confirms these threats were real. There is no mention in the FBI files of the Memphis Mafia being used as an intelligence source. And no member of the group has ever claimed they were working for the FBI. In fact, their accounts, both positive and negative, paint a picture of a life that was often chaotic and undisciplined, the opposite of a professional intelligence unit. They were enablers of Elvis's worst impulses as much as they were his protectors. The idea of them filing systematic reports to the FBI seems completely at odds with the reality of their day-to-day existence, which was centered entirely on the whims of their famous boss. But could Elvis have been using them without their full knowledge? Might he have been debriefing them after a night out, extracting pieces of information for his own secret reports, while they just thought they were having a casual conversation with their friend? Were the law enforcement toys he gave them, the badges, the guns, the radios, not just gifts, but tools of a trade they didn't even know they were a part of? And was the Memphis Mafia, in the end, the most cleverly disguised spy ring in American history? Number 6 was his famous generosity, a way to pay informants. Elvis Presley was famous for his extravagant generosity. He would spontaneously give away cars, jewelry, and houses to friends, family, and sometimes complete strangers. The official story is that this was simply part of his character. He grew up poor, and once he became wealthy, he took immense pleasure in sharing his fortune. But a more cynical and conspiratorial claim suggests this generosity had a hidden purpose. It was not just kindness, it was a system of payment. Elvis was using these gifts to pay his network of informants. This theory recasts Elvis's most beloved trait as a shrewd intelligence tactic. A Cadillac wasn't just a car, it was a bonus for valuable information. A diamond ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a retainer for future services. In the world of espionage, paying sources is a fundamental requirement, but it has to be done discreetly. Cash payments can be traced, but who would question Elvis Presley for giving away a car? It was his trademark. He was using his public image as a generous superstar to run a covert payment system in plain sight. The potential informants in this network could have been anyone. Local police officers in the cities he visited who provided him with extra security and inside information. Hotel employees who reported on the activities of other high-profile guests. Fellow musicians who shared gossip about the drug scene or political leanings within the industry. By rewarding these people with lavish gifts, Elvis ensured their loyalty and kept the information flowing. This would have been a brilliant way to operate completely off the books and deniable. The FBI would not have to dirty its hands with direct payments. Their star asset handled it himself. The evidence is, by its nature, impossible to prove. It relies on reinterpreting known facts. Every documented case of Elvis's generosity is seen through a lens of suspicion. For example, his habit of giving cars to police officers is presented not as a gesture of appreciation for law enforcement, but as a direct payment for their cooperation in his intelligence gathering activities. The sheer scale of his gift giving, which amounted to millions of dollars over his career, is argued to be too excessive to be mere kindness. It must have had a strategic purpose. However, this theory runs contrary to the overwhelming testimony of the people who knew him best. His friends and family, including Priscilla Presley, have consistently described his generosity as impulsive and emotional. He gave things away because it made him feel good. It was a way for him to connect with people and to exercise the power that his great wealth gave him. There was often no rhyme or reason to it. He might give a car to someone he had just met. This impulsiveness is the opposite of a calculated system for paying intelligence sources. And furthermore, there is no documentation in his FBI file or anywhere else to suggest such a scheme. The people who received his gifts have always told their stories with a sense of wonder and gratitude, not as if they were receiving payment for a covert service. The theory also requires believing that hundreds of people, from sheriffs to maids to other celebrities, were part of a secret network, and that not one of them has ever broken their silence about the true nature of their relationship with Elvis. It is far more plausible that Elvis was exactly what he seemed, a man of immense wealth and immense impulses, who expressed his feelings through material gifts. But the questions are intriguing. If you were running a secret network, wouldn't making the payments public be the most brilliant cover of all? Could Elvis have had a two-tiered system, with some gifts being genuine and others being carefully planned payments? And is it possible that some of the people who received a free Cadillac from the king knew they were getting more than just a car, but a message to keep their eyes and ears open? Number 5, was his army service the beginning of his FBI relationship? Elvis Presley's induction into the U.S. Army in 1958 was a pivotal moment in his career. At the height of his fame, he was drafted and served as a regular soldier for 2 years, spending much of that time in Germany. The public narrative is that he served his country honorably, and this experience helped transform his image from a rebellious teen idol to a respectable mainstream entertainer. The unverified claim, however, is that his time in the army was more than just military service. It was his training ground and the true beginning of his relationship with American intelligence, including the FBI. According to this theory, the U.S. government saw the drafting of Elvis not as a routine matter, but as a unique opportunity. They had the most famous young man in the world under their direct control. In Germany, he was stationed on the front lines of the Cold War. It was the perfect place to vet him, train him, and recruit him for future intelligence work. The proponents of this theory suggest he was approached by officers from Army intelligence or even liaisons from the FBI or CIA. They would have seen his potential as an asset who could travel the world and be welcomed everywhere. The evidence pointed to was the dramatic change in Elvis's public persona after he left the Army. He went from being the sneering rebel of Jailhouse Rock to the clean-cut, family-friendly star of movies like G.I. Blues. This transformation, the theory argues, was too abrupt to be natural. It was a deliberate rebranding, part of his new role as a patriotic asset for the government. His service in Germany would have exposed him to the realities of the Cold War and the threat of communism, solidifying the patriotic views he would later express to Nixon and the FBI. Some even speculate that he was involved in low-level intelligence work while in Germany, perhaps reporting on the morale of his fellow soldiers or observing the political climate. The Army would have been the ideal environment to test his loyalty and discipline. If he could follow orders as a soldier, he could follow them as an agent. His assignment as a jeep driver for a reconnaissance platoon is sometimes cited as proof he was being trained in surveillance and observation. It was during his time in the Army that he was introduced to amphetamines to stay awake on duty, the beginning of his lifelong struggle with prescription drugs. Some theorists even suggest this was a deliberate tactic by his handlers to make him more dependent and controllable. However, the historical record provides no support for this claim. Biographers like Peter Guralnick have meticulously documented Elvis's time in the Army, and their accounts are of a young man trying to cope with the loss of his mother and the disruption of his career. He was treated, for the most part, like any other soldier. His rebranding after his service was a calculated career move engineered by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, who wanted to broaden Elvis's appeal to a wider, more adult audience through light-hearted Hollywood musicals. It was about commerce, not counterintelligence. There is nothing in Elvis's military record or his FBI file to suggest he was recruited or trained for intelligence work during this period. The FBI file, in fact, shows that their main interest in him during the late 1950s was fielding complaints from concerned parents and church groups who thought his music was corrupting the youth. They saw him as a social problem, not a potential recruit. His introduction to amphetamines was sadly a common practice among soldiers at the time and not part of some sinister plot. The story of his Army service being a secret agent training program appears to be a conspiracy theory layered on top of a well-documented and much simpler reality. But still, doubts can linger. Could a recruitment during his Army service have been so secret that it would never be committed to his official military or FBI files? Was the dramatic shift in his career path after the Army purely the Colonel's idea? Or was he being guided by a more powerful unseen hand? And did Private Presley learn more in Germany than just how to drive a Jeep and salute an officer? Number 4. Did the FBI use him to monitor other celebrities? As Hollywood and the music industry have always been of interest to the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover in particular was suspicious of the entertainment world, which he saw as a potential hotbed of communist sympathy, moral decay, and subversive influence. The claim here is that the FBI used Elvis Presley, one of the biggest stars in that world, as their inside man. His job was to monitor the activities, political leanings, and private lives of other celebrities and report back to the Bureau. This theory casts Elvis in the role of a Hollywood spy. With his status, he had access to everyone. He worked with hundreds of actors and musicians. He attended parties and social events. He was an insider in the truest sense. If the FBI wanted to know if a certain movie star was a secret communist, if a popular singer was involved in the anti-war movement, or if a studio head had ties to organized crime, Elvis was in a perfect position to find out. He could engage his colleagues in casual conversation, ask seemingly innocent questions, and observe their behavior, all under the cover of his friendly, down-to-earth persona. The evidence for this is largely circumstantial. It starts with Elvis's own stated desire to help the FBI fight anti-American elements. It is logical to assume that the first place he would look for such elements would be his own backyard, the entertainment industry. His specific complaint to President Nixon about the Beatles is seen as the tip of the iceberg, a documented example of what was likely a much broader, ongoing activity. The theory suggests that Elvis took his self-appointed role as a moral guardian seriously and saw it as his patriotic duty to keep tabs on his more liberal-minded peers. Proponents also point to the deep paranoia that existed in Hollywood during the Cold War era, a legacy of the blacklist and the House Un-American Activities Committee WAC hearings. The practice of neighbors informing on neighbors and friends on friends was not unheard of. In that context, the idea of the FBI using a major star as an informant is not as far-fetched as it might sound. The FBI files on dozens of other celebrities, from Charlie Chaplin to Frank Sinatra, prove that the Bureau was intensely interested in the private lives of the rich and famous. However, once again, there is no documentary proof to back up this claim. Elvis's FBI file contains no intelligence reports from him about other celebrities. There are no memos from FBI agents discussing information he had provided. The files of other stars who were under surveillance do not list Elvis as a source. The members of his Memphis Mafia, who were with him constantly, have never spoken of any such activities. Their stories suggest Elvis was more often isolated and absorbed in his own world than he was engaged in the social and political life of Hollywood. His public interactions with other stars like Sammy Davis Jr., Tom Jones, or Anne Margaret appear to have been based on professional respect and personal friendship, not a covert agenda. While his politics were conservative, there is little to suggest he was an active witch hunter. His complaint about the Beatles seems to have been a rare and specific outburst, likely fueled by professional jealousy as much as political conviction. The image of Elvis as a secret agent, moving through Hollywood parties with a hidden microphone, seems to belong in one of his own B-movies rather than in reality. But could his reports on other celebrities be in a file that is still classified? Does he trade gossip with his FBI contacts verbally, leaving no paper trail? And when Elvis met with other stars backstage, were his friendly questions about their lives and their views really as innocent as they seemed? Number 3 was the FBI monitoring him as a national threat. This claim flips the entire narrative on its head. It suggests that the FBI's interest in Elvis was not as a potential asset, but as a potential threat. In this version of the story, the FBI did not see a patriot they wanted to recruit. They saw a cultural revolutionary whose influence over the youth of America was a danger to the established social order. His file was not a collection of fan mail and death threats. It was a surveillance file, similar to the ones they kept on Martin Luther King Jr. or John Lennon. The theory begins in the 1950s. When Elvis first exploded onto the national scene, the reaction from the establishment was one of moral panic. His music was decried as youngle music. His dancing was condemned as obscene. Ministers, politicians, and community leaders warned that he was a corrupting influence on teenagers, promoting rebellion and sexual promiscuity. The FBI, under the notoriously puritanical J. Edgar Hoover, would have shared these concerns. The claim is that they opened a file on him not to protect him, but to monitor him. They were looking for any evidence of communist ties, criminal activity, or moral turpitude that could be used to discredit him and neutralize his influence. The evidence for this comes from the early pages of his FBI file. The file does indeed contain letters from the public demanding that the FBI investigate Elvis. One letter from 1956 warns that Elvis is a definite danger to the security of the United States. The writer claimed that his performances were creating sexual stimulation among teenagers, and that this could be part of a communist plot to undermine the nation's morality. The FBI's response to these letters was non-committal, but the fact that they were kept and filed is seen as proof that the Bureau took them seriously. Proponents of this theory argue that Elvis's later attempts to align himself with the FBI and Nixon were a calculated move to get on the right side of the very people who were investigating him. He knew he was being watched, so he overcompensated by becoming a super patriot. His offers to become an informant were a desperate attempt to prove his loyalty and get the Bureau off his back. He was trying to join them because he was afraid of them. However, a full reading of the FBI file does not support the idea of a sustained surveillance campaign against Elvis. While the Bureau did collect the early complaint letters, there is no indication they ever launched a full-scale investigation based on them. There are no wiretaps, no records of physical surveillance, no informants planted in his entourage. The file's focus shifts very quickly from Elvis as a threat in the 50s to threats against Elvis in the 60s and 70s. The bulk of the documents relate to extortion plots and death threats, where the FBI's role was clearly protective. The internal FBI memos consistently refer to him as an entertainer and show more concern with managing his celebrity status than with investigating him as a subversive. Hoover's own notes indicate he found Elvis's style distasteful, but did not see him as a national security risk. compared to the massive aggressive surveillance operations the FBI mounted against figures like Martin Luther King Jr., the file on Elvis looks passive and reactive. The story of the FBI seeing him as a major threat seems to be an exaggeration of the moral panic of the 1950s. But the question of motive remains. Was the FBI's protective stance in the later years just a cover? Could they have been using the very real threats against him as a pretext to keep him under close observation? And was Elvis's lifelong quest for a federal badge driven not by patriotism but by a deep-seated fear that the government saw him as the enemy? Number 2, were his law enforcement badges more than a hobby? Elvis Presley's obsession with collecting law enforcement badges and memorabilia is well known. He had badges from police departments and sheriff's offices all over the country. He cherished them, often wore them, and even used them to pull over speeding motorists as a prank. The official story is that this was a harmless, if eccentric, hobby born from a genuine respect for police officers. The unverified claim, however, is that these badges were not just souvenirs. They were tools of the trade, quasi-official credentials that gave him a degree of authority and access for his secret work with the FBI. According to this theory, the badges were a key part of his cover. When Elvis was gathering information, he could flash a badge to gain someone's trust or to get into a restricted area. A local police badge would give him credibility with other officers, allowing him to ask questions about local criminal activity or political unrest without raising suspicion. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was one of the boys. His ultimate goal was to get a federal badge, which he finally did from President Nixon. Believers in this theory argue that this B&D badge, while officially honorary, was understood by Elvis and his handlers to be a license to operate on a national level. The evidence for this is Elvis's own behavior. He took the badges very seriously. He studied the law and police procedure. He had police radios installed in his cars. Members of the Memphis Mafia have told stories of Elvis showing up at crime scenes or accident sites, a badge pinned to his coat, offering to help the officers in charge. This was not the behavior of a casual hobbyist. It was the behavior of someone who believed he had a real functional role in law enforcement. His desire for the federal badge was not about adding to his collection, it was about getting a promotion. The FBI file documents his close relationships with various police departments, particularly in Memphis and Denver. He made large donations to police charities and spent time with officers. The theory suggests these relationships were not just about civic-mindedness. They were about building a network. The FBI would have encouraged this, as it gave their asset a support system in cities across the country. The badges were the symbols of this nationwide informal law enforcement fraternity with Elvis at its center. However, the simpler explanation is that Elvis was a man who, because of his immense fame and wealth, was able to live out his childhood fantasies. He was playing cops and robbers for real. The police departments, in turn, were happy to indulge their city's most famous resident and benefactor by giving him honorary badges and making him feel like part of the team. There is no evidence that any of these badges conferred any actual legal authority. The B&D was clear that his federal badge was purely symbolic. The stories of him assisting at crime scenes are likely exaggerated or describe situations where police were simply humoring a superstar. No police department has ever stated that Elvis Presley was a sworn reserve officer or that his badges were anything other than vanity items. His deep knowledge of police work likely came from his passion for the subject, not from any formal training by the FBI. The badges were props in his personal psychodrama, a way to connect with the world of order and authority that he admired, but they were not the credentials of a secret agent. But what if some of the badges were different? Could certain police chiefs, in on the secret, have given him badges that did carry some unofficial weight? Was his B&D badge activated by a secret agreement with the White House, even if the agency's official position was that it was honorary? And when Elvis flashed one of his many badges, was he just playing a role? Or was he reminding himself and a select few others of the secret duty he had sworn to uphold? Number 1, was he recruited to be a king for America? This is the grand overarching claim that ties all the others together. It suggests that Elvis Presley's involvement with the FBI was not about specific, small-time tasks like informing on celebrities or investigating the mob. It was part of a much larger, more ambitious project. The claim is that Elvis was recruited by a faction within the US government to be a cultural weapon in the Cold War. His title, the King, was to be made literal. He was to be a symbolic king for America, a pro-American patriotic icon designed to counter the influence of communist and counterculture movements both at home and abroad. The theory posits that in the late 1960s, with the country torn apart by Vietnam, race riots, and student protests, powerful figures in Washington, perhaps even in a secret cabal including Hoover and elements of the Nixon administration, saw a crisis of national identity. They believed the country was losing its moral compass. They needed a symbol to rally around, someone who embodied traditional American values but was also beloved by the youth. They found their man in Elvis Presley. His comeback in 1968, his patriotism, and his immense popularity made him the perfect candidate. His mission was not to be a spy in a trench coat. It was to be Elvis. He was to perform concerts that were celebrations of America. He was to wear his famous eagle and flag jumpsuits. He was to sing songs like An American Trilogy. His public statements and actions would be subtly guided to promote a message of unity, respect for the flag, and support for law and order. His meeting with Nixon was not an audition, it was his coronation. The president was officially anointing him as America's cultural ambassador. His connection with the FBI was not about being an informant, but about receiving protection and guidance for this crucial national mission. The evidence for this is the entire trajectory of his later career. The shift from the rebellious rocker to the patriotic Vegas showman is seen as proof of this deliberate plan. His concerts were choreographed, patriotic spectacles. His movies had become bland and inoffensive. He publicly decried the very counterculture that rock and roll had helped create. He was, in effect, a propaganda tool, and his work with the FBI was to ensure the success and security of that propaganda effort. The government couldn't create a star with his appeal, but they could co-opt one. However, this grand theory crumbles under scrutiny. Elvis's career choices were overwhelmingly driven by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, whose sole motivation was money. The Vegas shows were profitable. The patriotic jumpsuits sold tickets. An American Trilogy was a showstopper. There is no need for a government conspiracy to explain these decisions. They were simply good business. Elvis's personal conservative views were genuine, a product of his upbringing, not a script handed to him by the FBI. The FBI file, with its dismissive attitude toward Elvis, completely contradicts the idea that he was seen as a central figure in a national cultural strategy. The government did not need to recruit Elvis to be patriotic. He already was. He was a willing symbol, but not a controlled one. The image of a secret committee in Washington masterminding Elvis's career is a compelling fiction, but the reality is that his path was shaped by a shrewd manager, his own personal beliefs, and the demands of the entertainment market. He was the king of rock and roll, but he was never the king of America in any official, government-sanctioned capacity. But the final, most shocking questions remain. What if the colonel, with his own mysterious past and immigration status, was the government's point of contact, using his control over Elvis to steer him in the right direction? Could the story of Elvis, the secret agent, be the ultimate conspiracy, a tale so unbelievable that it serves as the perfect cover for the simpler, stranger truth that the most powerful government on earth saw the king of rock and roll not as a singer but as their last best hope to win the hearts and minds of a generation they had lost? And did Elvis know the role he was playing, or was he the most famous pawn in a game he never even knew existed?